Welcome back to Feminism, Fascism, and the Future. I'm Alison Seeger.
And I'm Laurie Essig.
So, Laurie, before we start this podcast, we need to come up with some music. I've picked out a few. You tell me what you think, all right?
All right.
All right, first one. It's called The Sounds of Mother Goddess. What you think?
Definitely not.
Definitely not? Okay. How about Political Digest?
No.
You don't like this one?
I'd like to dance to it.
Yeah, it's kind of groovy, isn't it? Yeah, all right. Okay, I'm going for this one then. Mood Trap in London, because that's my hometown.
I can live with that.
You can live with that?
Yeah.
Shall we start off with this one then, and then next week?
We'll find something better.
Brilliant. All right, off we go. Welcome back to Feminism, Fascism, and the Future. I'm Alison Seeger.
And I'm Laurie Essig.
In the first episode, we told you that the anti-gender ideology movement is spreading all over the world. We hope we scared you a little, because this movement is scary. Anti-gender ideology is against women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and civil rights. And it's also against democracy. That's why we call this movement fascist, because it is willing to take power by any means necessary, whether that's rigging an election, staging a coup d'etat, or using hatred of trans kids to ignite a populist movement.
In this episode, my colleague Catherine Wright and I talk with scholars studying the global anti-gender movement. They explain how the movement started in the Catholic Church and then spread into right-wing populist politics in Russia.
Let's start with how the movement began.
My name is Agnieszka Graff. I live in Warsaw. I work at the American Studies Center at Warsaw University. I'm the author of a number of books. Most relevant to our conversation today is a book I published last year with my co-author Elżbieta Korolczuk, which is called Anti-Gender Politics in the Populist Moment. And it's a monograph on what we call the global anti-gender movement. And it's our contribution to a growing body of research on this new conservatism.
So what is this anti-gender movement or anti-gender ideology movement? Could you describe it for our listeners?
It is a conglomerate or coalition or network of organizations that have sprung up in the last 2 decades, which are ultra-conservative, usually religious, but often using secular language, which are connected by the opposition to what they call gender ideology. They kidnapped the word gender from gender studies and the post-second wave feminist culture and resignified it to mean awful things in a variety of areas, basically disorder, danger, chaos in the realm of kinship, reproductive rights, family. So they are a new version of what used to be called the family values movement in the United States. And the difference is that they are global, that they are connected to each other, that they are funded from shady sources, some of which are from Russia, but there are also many other sources, including American ultra-conservative groups and networks. So this is a very well-funded effort. What used to puzzle scholars, but I think is no longer a puzzle, is this peculiar usage of the word gender. But what makes this a fascinating research area is that depending on where you go, the emphasis is different. So for instance, in Spain, the groups that operate in this way tend to focus on violence against women, and they re-signify it as domestic violence, and they're obsessed with this idea that men are being falsely accused of violence. In France, Manif pour tous has focused mostly on the new kinship arrangements that have to do with gay marriage and the new legal solutions that enable, for instance, lesbians to have children through IVF. So they have this whole discourse about children needing both father and mother. In Poland, which is where we based most of our research and participant observation, it's basically good old homophobia, although recently it has been revamped into transphobia, which is, of course, what's going on in the States, that trans rights are the main target, in part because gay rights have become something that most people support. And what is always on the table, but sometimes more and sometimes less explicitly so, is the idea that abortion is murder and needs to be banned. But depending on where you go, they will either say this explicitly, as they have been doing increasingly in the United States, and especially since Roe v. Wade was withdrawn. But in other cases, like in Sweden, for instance, these groups will use arguments from freedom of conscience, making these legal solutions, for instance, for midwives to refuse to take part in abortions based on their conscience. So they're very smart in shaping their arguments and their legal strategies to match the local cultural and legal context. They're just much smarter than what used to be the anti-feminist movements in, let's say, in the United States. Phyllis Schlafly or Anita Bryant, whom we compared to some of these strategies, they're really quite quaint and naive compared to these folks. The identity of the movement was pretty strongly attached to the Catholic Church, and rightly so, if you're interested in history. The idea that gender is evil, that it's a culprit, that it's the messenger of modernity and anathema to the Catholic Church, this has a pretty long history that goes back to Beijing, 1995, Mexico, the big conferences on women's rights that in the mid-90s started using the word gender, and so kind of, changing from let's protect women's rights against sexism to a much broader way of thinking about gender, which we also know from gender studies.
This concept that nations are responsible for protecting women's rights was a relatively new idea in the 1990s. When Hillary Clinton spoke at the 1995 Beijing Conference on Women, her words were considered pretty radical.
If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
And the Catholic Church at the time reacted with documents about the gender agenda. And in fact, the origins of this new way of thinking of conservatism also originate in the United States. There was this woman called Dale O'Leary. I was quite fascinated with her for a while, who apparently made a huge impression on the Pope at the time.
Dale O'Leary wrote one of the first books that convinced religious conservatives that the real enemy is gender ideology. The book, The Gender Agenda, was published a couple of years after O'Leary attended the Beijing conference. For O'Leary, the talk of gender at the conference was part of the hidden agenda by feminists to destroy the traditional roles of men and women. O'Leary said,
I observed that the UN is inhabited by people who believe that what the world needs is the elimination of the differences between men and women.
O'Leary was also really upset by what she saw as the UN's encouragement of homosexuality.
These people promote homosexuality and sex education and encourage sexual experimentation among children and teach them how to get contraception and abortions. That homosexuality is normal and that men and women are the same.
Like O'Leary, the Vatican saw the attempts to insert gender into United Nations documents as a threat to the traditional order of things and began to speak out. In 2001, Pope John Paul II declared that misleading concepts concerning sexuality and the dignity and mission of the woman are driven by specific ideologies on gender. In 2002, the Vatican's Council for the Family asserted that,
quote, a feminist ideology known as gender has led to a misunderstanding of the complementary difference between man and woman.
Even Pope Francis, who's been progressive on many issues, sees gender ideology as a real threat.
Hello, I'm Nick Wiley. Today's May 1st, 2023, the Feast of St. Joseph the Worker. Here are your latest church militant headlines. During a 3-day apostolic trip to Hungary, Pope Francis spoke out against gender ideology in an address to civil authorities in the capital city of Budapest. The pontiff said, "This is the nefarious path of ideological colonization, which eliminates differences, as in the case of so-called gender culture." The Pope also spoke out against abortion and praised Hungary's pro-family policies, effective in reversing population decline in the 1,000-year-old Christian country.
As Professor Graff pointed out, O'Leary's work had a huge impact on the Catholic leadership, but political leaders weren't really paying attention to gender in the 1990s.
I was among the founders of the gender studies in Poland in the late 90s. And in a lot of Eastern European countries, nobody thought gender was political at the time. We actually benefited from that because we were doing, feminist research under the banner of gender. It was just something Western, theoretical, and safe. And then suddenly around 2012, gender was worse than feminism. Gender was the thing chasing children down the street. We had tabloids in Poland discussing the dangers of gender. We have some photographs in our book taken at anti-gender rallies. You would have parents of small children with banners featuring a bomb and the word gender, right? So suddenly it went mainstream and it became a rallying point for a populist discourse, which associated gender and all the associated evils with the elites. So this new rhetoric, it wasn't theological, it was political, and it was populist in the sense that conservatism was positioning itself as a defender of ordinary people.
Can you tell us how it's different from early backlashes against the LGBTQ and feminist movements?
It's a different language. It's an ultra-conservative language, but it describes the same thing that leftists have long been describing as the withdrawal of the welfare state, or in broader terms, as neoliberalism. So our argument is that the anti-gender movement is a populist movement. It's right-wing populism. And that is precisely what makes it different from earlier versions of backlash. Earlier versions of backlash tended to be, especially in the United States, unabashedly pro-free market. So they were going hand in hand with neoliberalism. And the version that we get now, especially in Europe, is actually a critique of neoliberalism. It's a conservative critique or reactionary critique, whichever word you want to use.
So this movement is different because it's not just anti-gay or anti-feminist like earlier movements, but it's populist. It claims to represent regular people against the global elites who run everything. And it's often violent and anti-democratic, which is where it strays into fascism. If most people support gender equality, these movements have to be anti-democratic to get into power. And as we know, all fascist movements create an internal enemy who is responsible for everything that goes wrong. For the Nazis, it was the Jews. For the anti-gender ideology movement, the enemy is a mix of LGBTQ persons, feminists, immigrants, and migrants. And of course, it also continues to blame Jews for all the problems of this moment. That's why the white supremacist protests in Charlottesville in 2017 also targeted Jews.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!
What we are seeing since we started the research around 2013 is that they are increasingly willing to engage in violence and to claim that violence is okay. And that is, of course, a cornerstone of fascism, that it re-invites violence into politics, claiming that democratic deliberation is actually a form of decadence, that it is not just populist, but actually actively anti-liberal. They basically believe that liberal democracy has lived its days and that a more robust political system is necessary in order to defend the ordinary people against the onslaught of decadence, foreignness, immigration, gender, whatever the enemy might be, it's always powerful, dangerous, and defending ourselves against this enemy requires violence. And the figure of an evil that needs to be pushed away is, of course, central to how both Italian and German fascism functioned at the time. That figure was the Jew. And if you look at the history of European anti-Semitism, it has elements that are very strongly gendered. And that's what I looked at in my research in order to understand why it sounds so familiar to someone. And I am a Polish Jew. And the reason it looks so familiar is that it's the same discourse. So Jews were seen as effeminate. They were seen as incapable of sexual self-restraint. Jewish women were seen as supersexual. Jewish men were seen as decadent, effeminate, but also incapable of monogamy. And of course, they were accused of kidnapping children and doing evil things to them, which tended to function as the justification or even the call for pogroms. And these sets of ideas, this association of ethnic foreignness with decadence of a certain kind, and also the idea that we're talking about a group that has taken over the media. This is where the decadent homosexual and the decadent Jew meet in some of these ideas.
So the argument is that in some ways, gender as a category replaces Jew in a fascist discourse. But in other ways, the anti-gender movement is also anti-Semitic and uses a lot of coded anti-Semitic language and tropes to speak about gender as the enemy. Professor Graff wants us to be aware that this movement is not just accidentally anti-Semitic, but purposefully so, in a way that ties the figure of the evil Jew with corrupting gender ideology, both of which threaten our children and the future. And she wants us to be aware that the way to fight this populist fascism is with a feminist movement that is also populist.
So what we argue is that feminism, this new wave of feminism, sometimes referred to as the fourth wave, is also a populist movement. And by that, we don't mean that it's authoritarian or silly or stupid. No, we mean that it uses this frame of we the people against them the elites, and it goes back to politics of emotions in ways that were more or less abandoned or forgotten by feminism through the 90s and the first decades of the 21st century. And you can see it. You can see it in the streets. In Poland, we've had these three waves of protests.
Dlatego tutaj jesteśmy.
The Polish opposition is calling this one of the biggest anti-government demonstrations in decades. Up to 500,000 people on the streets of Warsaw, saying no to the government of Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, who's dismissed the protest as a circus. They also denounced President Andrzej Duda, blaming his PiS, or Law and Justice Party, for the rising cost of living. Many carried EU flags.
I'm fed up with the rulers. I want to live in a European country that's free and democratic, where minority rights and women's rights are respected, where the church does not rule. I'm marching for my daughter and my granddaughter and all my relatives.
It's an extremely angry language, mobilizing women in their capacity as ordinary people. What you need is an opposition that will take feminism seriously and allow it to be equally furious, right? Not feminist NGOs doing their little legal reforms, but an opposition that will take angry women on board as serious political players. And I think that's happening in a lot of places, that these issues are taking center stage when the left or liberals win elections. In Poland, for the first time since 1989, the opposition has actually listened to women. And Tusk, who is the leader of the opposition party, has promised legalizing abortion, like fully legalizing it. We have to be building coalitions between radical feminist social movements. By that, I don't mean the kind of radical feminism that has been attacking trans rights, but serious political feminism. And whoever in a given context is taking on these authoritarian groups. I think we're learning to do this. We're learning not to dismiss gender as just culture. It's not just culture. It's the playing field where democracy is being fought for. We used to shy away from melodrama. And I think this new wave of feminism is using emotions in these ways, and it needs to. You don't conquer a populist agenda with liberal democratic argumentation, right? And I think that the battle that is going to take place in Poland in the next elections is going to be a final battle for democracy.
Newsflash, newsflash.
Okay, listeners, we finally have something hopeful to tell you. When Professor Graff gave us this interview in the summer of 2023, it looked like the Law and Justice Party was going to keep its hold on power and continue to use anti-gender rhetoric to rile up the masses. But the opposition movement that formed from feminist activism was able to get enough votes in October 2023 to push the Law and Justice Party out of power.
That's such good news.
Yeah, at least in Poland, and at least for now. But the anti-gender ideology movement continues unabated elsewhere, like in Russia.
If you think of the way the anti-gender rhetoric has been used by Putin, I mean, we're talking about mass murder. We're not talking about intellectual debates over, differences between men and women. So these are really scary people. Some of the most interesting conversations I've had on how these issues interact with big politics have been with Ukrainians. For instance, the way that gay rights have gone from a marginal issue to an issue that is proudly worn by soldiers, and not just, people who happen to be gay and soldiers, but just Ukrainian soldiers fighting Putin's invasion as a sign of Europeanness, as a sign of the, dream of democracy. So the rainbow flag, interestingly, went from being a sexual minority symbol to a symbol of democracy in the part of the world where I live. And that, of course, includes the trans rights flag as well. The broader wave of history is that, Putin is our enemy, and trans and LGBTQ rights are part of the new democratic package that people like Ukrainians fighting for their homeland believe in.
So now we've reached a pretty interesting moment. Putin's war in Ukraine has turned many people away from the war and gender ideology, even people who previously thought of Putin as a savior of traditional civilization. Since the war in Ukraine, anti-LGBTQ politics are now firmly associated with anti-democratic regimes. In order to find out more, we turn to one of the world's leading experts on the use of anti-gay propaganda in Russian politics, Alexander Kondakov.
Some people call me Sasha. That's very common. Actually, in Russia, to call Alexander Sasha. And I work in University College Dublin in Ireland. I'm an assistant professor there. My work is all about, queer theory, anti-queer violence, LGBT rights, and basically it's usually focused on what's happening in Russia. This is where I'm from originally, and so focusing on what's happening there. In fact, indeed, I wrote a book published last year. It's called Violent Affections, and it has many different topics, but I think most importantly, it's about how power works and about this emotional aspect of power, especially in relation to how politicians use anti-queer, anti-LGBT arguments to legitimize their non-democratic authority, their non-democratic ways. And Russia served as a very good example of that, even though this kind of thing is not limited to Russia only.
This is so interesting because it's not limited to Russia. But I do feel like Putin did it first, right? I mean, he was the one who set the example of how to take this anti-LGBT, but also anti-gender ideology, use it to shore up his support or his base of supporters. So I'm wondering, can you think back on when you first started noticing Putin using this rhetoric and how that history played out in Russia? How he did it?
Putin is definitely one of the earliest and one of the most successful politicians who used anti-gender rhetoric to amass people's support. And I think he actually started more with anti-feminist kind of discourse in the beginning of 2000s, strengthening of heteronormativity and heterosexual privilege more generally in his policies and in his politics in Russia, that centered on family values and family more generally understood in a very narrow way as a heterosexual family of a man and a woman, and they're preferably 2 or 3 kids of also different genders. So that was kind of his starting point in his policies, and kind of paving the road to more overt and more articulate homophobia and transphobia and all other kinds of misogyny that you can only imagine, that is so obvious today, right? But that started with more subtle policies of putting these traditional family values at the center, at the core of governmental politics and policies. Literally, paying people for children, this kind of stuff. So not something too complicated. And then somewhere in the parallel, so I don't want to give too much credit to an individual, Vladimir Putin himself. It's a more general kind of trend, maybe an institution, maybe a social process that he is just part of, and there are many more people who contributed to it and who kind of worked towards the goals, ends that Putin's government introduced and pursued lately. But he's not the only one. And one of the examples here can again be an example from Russia, where, for example, this gay propaganda law was first introduced in 2006, right? So quite early, and 7 years before it was introduced on the federal level. It was introduced in a region that's it's called Ryazan. That's a very small region, and many people didn't even know that the gay propaganda ban existed there. But it was introduced quite early there, and I think Putin has nothing to do with it. Maybe American evangelicals have more to do with it than Putin.
American evangelicals like Scott Lively regularly traveled to Russia starting in the 1990s to spread the gospel of anti-gender ideology. Here is Lively in Russia.
The gay movement is an evil institution. The goal of the gay movement is to defeat the marriage-based society.
So Kondakov is pointing out the influence of American evangelical Christians on these first anti-gay laws, like the one in Ryazan in 2006.
That was the first instance of homophobic legislation introduced on the Russian territory, legislation that is now known as gay propaganda bans, and that eventually arrived to the level of federal legislation in 2013. And then you look at the parallel kind of development somewhere in the regions of Russia where gay propaganda bans were introduced as early as in 2006. And then you see how these two ideas kind of come together in 2010s and reach the federal level at the moment when the Kremlin and Putin personally needs those kinds of policies more than ever, at the moment of crisis, of political crisis, and especially crisis of democratic legitimacy, when people were against his power and his return to the presidency. That's when this all kind of resonated in the federal policy there.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, because I think what you're trying to get us to think about is how this isn't ever one fascist, no matter how good that fascist is at propagandizing. Yeah, but rather it's a movement, right? And this anti-gender ideology movement, which, as you correctly point out, is really a religious movement. And in particular, American evangelicals and the Catholic Church pushing this idea that the real threat to the future is feminism and homosexuality as related threats, right? As against the family, as something that will bring down civilization. And I think the other thing that happened during those years is a Pussy Riot, right? Their protests in the cathedral, which was 2011, I think. So that's a kind of, there are these things going on, these protests against Putin, the Pussy Riot protest, the successful passage of the gay propaganda law. And so all these things are kind of happening together. And of course, the Putin regime just sees that it's possible to manipulate them in all these ways that shore up their base. But then the feeling, especially among religious individuals, that the threat to the future was gender and some sort of shaking up of traditional gender and sex roles, that was there because of the evangelical movements that also were in conversation with Orthodox movements, and these were, in conversation with the Catholics, right? So that's where it starts to begin. But Putin has been so successful at using it, and you more than anyone know that history. So how has the Putin regime, or I guess I should say politicians in Russia, I wonder if you could, for our listeners, just outline some of the highlights of the way that this anti-gender, anti-LGBTQ rhetoric has been used over the past 10 years or so, by the regime.
I think the obvious thresholds are 2013 with the introduction of the first gay propaganda ban on the federal level, and that came as a sort of remedy for political situation back then. So Putin came to power in Russia in 1999, and he became the president in 2000. And according to the Russian constitution back then, it was possible to have 2 consecutive terms, each 4 years, right? So he served as a president for 2 terms, and in 2008, he became a prime minister. This was the time, it was 2011, when Putin said, I'm coming back, I want another term, right? That was unconstitutional. That was absolutely, illegitimate thing to even say, but he was going to do it, right? And he was going to push forward no matter what. And there was a lot of protests. So Pussy Riot is definitely part of this protest. They introduced a very important kind of feminist dimension of resistance to Putinism, because back then it was already clear that his power is based on misogyny and homophobia.
The members of the Pussy Riot Collective took over one of Moscow's most important cathedrals, Christ the Saviour, in February of 2012, and asked the Virgin Mary to get rid of Putin in what they called a punk prayer.
And so feminist and feminist movement were definitely part of the resistance to Putinism back then, for a good reason, right? And moreover, 2011, 2012 was the sort of political crisis that showed Russia is ready for all kinds of, democratic institutions and elections and everything. People wanted change. They wanted a different president, and it was St. Petersburg, it was Moscow, the big cities, but also small towns, cities in Siberia, all over Russia. People were protesting the very idea that the same guy can come back to the presidency when he didn't have the right to do so. The very idea when he announced that he's going to run for the 3rd time, which wasn't constitutional, people took to the streets, and there were millions of them. Minus 20, minus 30, it didn't matter.
They came in their thousands, the white ribbon opposition, Most of these people had never even been to a protest before this week, but after an election demonstrators say was rigged in favor of Vladimir Putin's United Russia Party, things have changed.
People realize that they don't exist for the authorities. They want to show they do, and that it's their country as well.
We're here because we think we can change something in our country.
When Putin realized, and the government in Kremlin in general realized that they cannot hold on to that power because people are against them, they started to rely on non-democratic tools to amass people's support and legitimacy. And gay propaganda ban was definitely one of the most powerful tools in this regard. They offered a kind of emotional legitimization of their power by trying to trigger people's prejudice, by trying to work with kind of emotional dimension of our societies, right? And trying to recruit people's homophobia and misogyny into their camp. They started to use articulately homophobic rhetoric and misogyny and transphobic rhetoric to legitimize their own power. And Putin was very successful in this. St. Petersburg legislation was one of the most widely discussed. It was introduced in 2011, so exactly at the time of political crisis. And it worked there. It worked in St. Petersburg, which was considered the most liberal, westernized city in Russia. It worked there for legitimization of power of homophobes and misogynists and fascists more generally without democratic means. And so they just shifted this employment of this cursive rhetorical tool to the federal level and started to discuss it on the federal level in 2012. And once again, in another crisis, last year in 2022, when Putin unleashed his new kind of escalated stage of war against Ukraine, people were not happy. And they were not happy to the point of 2011-2012 winter. They were ready to go to the streets and they were ready to protest the crazy idea of invading a neighboring country with which Russia shares so much history. And that's the point when the gay propaganda ban was introduced to the public sphere once again in 2022. They started to discuss amendments to the law, and eventually in November, December 2022, those amendments were adopted by the parliament and signed by Putin into law. And now this gay propaganda law, which covered just so-called protection for children, right? They could not access information on LGBT issues. Now it covers the entire adult population in Russia. And as if it wasn't enough, in 2023, Russian parliament, the State Duma, introduced another legislation prohibiting sex reassignment surgery, prohibiting the change of documents for transgender people, and taking away their right to custody of children, of their own children. So that's more or less what the history of the invocation of the use of these pieces of legislation for completely different kind of reasons, not for the reason to regulate certain behavior, but for the reason to legitimize power, misogynistic, homophobic power through non-democratic process.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it leads me to three, I don't know if they're questions or observations. One, Putin's justifying this war in Ukraine by using this anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. And two, he's able to shore up his support in Russia. I mean, to the extent he is shoring up his support in Russia, I guess that's a question that's not fully answered yet. But he's able to do that by utilizing fear of LGBTQ people. And then three, or the other thing, is this works so well because there's just no more free press in Russia. And because, right, to some extent he attacked the universities, the places that would have been able to do this sort of research that would have countered these narratives, right? So there's no counter narrative to his anti-gay rhetoric. So I guess those aren't questions as much as observations. But I do want to ask, Sasha, why do you think it worked so well?
It's impossible to say exactly, right? But my answer is that, it resonates somehow in the society because we have to admit our societies across this world, not only Russia, but Russia including, are homophobic. There are many people in Russia who are homophobic, who are misogynist. So it resonates with them. And in the context where they cannot actually access alternative knowledge, it resonates even better. So I guess it works. It does work simply because there is that feeling in human being, the feeling of homophobia. And politicians like Putin, they just use it. They use our prejudices. They use our biases, right? Our fear of the other for their own gain, for their own goals. And people have no alternative sources of knowledge or any kind of information, not necessarily knowledge. There are no alternatives anymore. And that all happened within, basically 10 years.
Yeah, it's really frightening because I see similar attempts really around the world. So if you think about Florida right now, I don't know if you know what's going on in terms of Ron DeSantis, but he attack on gender studies, on black studies, on critical race theory. He's attacking certain universities. He's trying to make tenure contingent upon politicians approving the work you're doing. And all of this comes in this narrative that everything about black studies, gender studies, gay movements, that's all foreign to Florida. It doesn't belong there, right? That's the same as Russia, right? DeSantis says Florida is where woke comes to die.
We seek normalcy, not philosophical lunacy. We will not allow reality, facts, and truth to become optional. We will never surrender to the woke mob. Florida is where woke goes to die.
And it's such a powerful way of controlling the population. I'm wondering if when you look at places like Florida or much of the southeastern United States and some of the middle of the U.S., when I see anti-abortion laws completely in effect, when I see anti-trans and anti-gay laws, how do we stop it? I mean, if you could give advice to our listeners, what do we do to make sure that Kansas and Texas and Florida aren't the next Russia? How do we stop this from happening?
First of all, we need to resist to all that. I mean, if there is still doubts in anyone that this is frivolous, that this is not important, that, feminism issues, feminist issues, LGBT rights, gender, these are kind of things that don't matter that much, you are wrong. They matter. If you look at Russia, they matter to the point that they can justify a full-scale war where, people are dying in numbers. If I could ever preach, this is my message, anti-gender movement, anti-gender rhetoric even, anti-LGBT legislation. This is all part of a larger logic that leads to war and justification of the most terrible political regimes under which nobody wants to live because nobody is safe then. So this is that we need to resist. To be honest, I am very pessimistic, but I don't want to share that pessimism actually with others. I want people to have hope, maybe.
I'm pessimistic too. But we're here at this moment, and at least in a few places we can continue to fight back. I think what you just said about fighting back and not losing the knowledge that we don't know what the future will bring, and we could shape it. I don't know, that might not be optimism, but let's just say it's rational pessimism.
Hopefully by now, you're convinced that the anti-gender ideology movement is a real threat. But before we tell you more about this movement, we need to take a huge detour. And that's because this entire movement is based on an understanding of the body, sex, and gender as fixed and knowable. But the thing is, that's really not what the evidence shows. Medical science, anthropology, and history all indicate that the body is not quite as simple as the anti-gender ideology wants us to believe. If we are ever going to defeat fascism, we need to actually value facts and knowledge and listen to the experts who have been studying the relationship between the body and culture.
So join us in episode 3, where we talk to experts about sex, science, and some of the truly bizarre overlaps between the anti-gender ideology movement and trans-exclusionary feminism. Also, if you would like to check out the full version of the interviews with Professors Graff and Kondakov, you can find them at Spotify or go to our website at tinyurl.com/feminism-fascism-future. That's tinyurl.com/feminism-fascism-future. I want to thank Agnieszka Graff and Alexander Kondakov for contributing to this episode. My colleague, Professor Catherine Wright, who helped conduct the interviews. Also, Harper Nichols for all things production and editorial. Julian Seeger-Reed for making magic with sound mixing and engineering. And finally, Allison Seeger, who is the executive producer of this podcast, which is just a fancy way of saying the person who gets everything done, from editing to sound to keeping me sane.
So, here we go again. This is where we need that theme song. Have you come up with anything better than last time? I really hope so.
Yeah, not really. How about you? Got any ideas?
Well, I was sitting outside the local food co-op today, and this little jingle came in my head. Do you want to hear it?
Yeah.
Okay. Feminism, fascism, and the future. What do you think?
That was good.
You think? No, you're just being nice.
Well, it's better than last week.
That's true. That's
okay.
true.